What is going on, everybody? Tonka here. Battle for Azeroth just around the corner, and I'm sure a lot of you are really excited to stream for it. I myself am actually looking forward to doing a little bit of streaming during the expansion launch as well, and hopefully deeper into the expansion. And one of the things that I needed to look up is, what do I want to stream at? What bitrate do I want to stream at? What resolution? What frame rate? Now, I know it's really difficult to know exactly what you want to stream at, although Twitch does have a very nice guide where they recommend some bit rates and frame rates and stuff like that that you can pick. Now, obviously, if you have amazing internet and you have a really good computer, you can go ahead and stream at 1080p, 60 frames per second, 6K bit rate, no problem. If that's what you're here for, then that's what you should be streaming at, 1080p, 60 frames per second, 6K bit rate. Just go stream with that right now. But the high likelihood is that you're here because you don't know exactly what frame rate you want to be streaming at and what bit rate you want to be streaming at, because you don't have the ability for your computer or for your internet to handle 1080p, 60 frames per second, 6K bit rate. So while I can't tell you exactly what settings you should be using, I can give you some examples and hopefully help you figure out exactly what would be the best frame rate, bit rate, and frames per second that you can stream at for Battle for Azeroth. Let's jump into some of these examples here. Now we're gonna start off with 480p, 30 frames per second, 2K bit rate. Now we're starting off at these settings because sometimes you don't have a very good computer and you don't have a very good upload, but you still want to stream. Even at 2K bit rate, this just does not look good. Honestly, if you're trying to stream at 480p though, you could probably stream at 1500 bit rate and be fine. But we're gonna look at just 30 frames per second here, and we'll actually move on to 60 frames per second. Moving into 3000 bit rate. Same problem, 480p just does not cut it for a crisp image. 60 frames per second, obviously smoother, but it's still same problem. It's just 480p is not pushing a lot of pixels out, so it's just not gonna look that good. As we move up into the higher bit rates, we're going to notice that it's still getting a little bit smoother and looking a little bit better, but really still 480p, big problem. Now when you're streaming at 480p, honestly what you should be doing is just go for a lower bit rate. You don't need 60 frames per second, just stream at 30 frames per second and you could be doing 2000. If you have the available internet bandwidth, go for it and stream at like 3 or 3500 kilobits per second. But when we're comparing between 30 and 60 frames per second, it's really not that noticeable just because 480p doesn't look that good. So let's move on into the sweet spot. This is 720p. Now at 30 frames per second and 2000 bit rate, you're going to notice that there's a lot of pixelation, but it doesn't look that bad. This is actually a very acceptable resolution and bitrate to be streaming at 30 frames per second. Doesn't look as buttery smooth as 60, as we'll notice in just a second, but at 3000 bitrate, it's starting to look pretty good, and 3500 bitrate actually looks quite good. Now moving into the 60 frames per second, at 2K bit rate, I wouldn't recommend 60 frames per second. I would stick with 30 frames per second. Even at 30 frames per second, 2K bit rate is just not really adequate to push those frames out. Starting to move into a more acceptable category, 3000 kilobits per second and 3500 kilobits per second. This is what you're going to want to be looking at for 60 frames per second, 720p at the very bottom end of it that I would recommend. Moving into 4000, 4500, 5000, those are going to look a lot better. So conclusion for 720p, you're definitely going to want to use a higher bit rate for this. If you only have about 3000 or 3500 bit rate to spare, just stick with with 30 frames per second, it really doesn't look that bad. And when we're comparing between 4K bitrate, 30 frames per second, and 60 frames per second, you notice that 60 frames per second is a lot more smooth. But really, 30 frames per second does not look that bad. People really want to shoot for that 60 frames per second, and I don't blame them. But when you are making sacrifices, I would really say you want to go for a better looking image versus more frames pushed, at least for World of Warcraft. So now we're going to move into the special resolution that I've decided to use today, and that's 810p. This is an option in OBS, and it's just a little step above 720p. So we started at 3000 and 3500, and we've also got 4000 bitrate in here. You can make the comparison yourself and see, but really 810p rather, looks pretty good at 30 frames per second and 3500 or 4K bitrate. This is a really good middle ground for somebody who has 3000 or 4000 kilobit per second upload and wants to stream a good looking image. You can give up that 60 frames per second and go for 30 frames per second at this bitrate, and it still looks pretty good. Obviously moving up into the higher bit rates here. I top off at 4000 bitrate, but really you probably want to be looking at 4500 or 5000 bitrate. In conclusion, 810p is a very strange resolution. Obviously, you don't hear a lot of people saying, "Oh yeah, I stream at 810p," but at 30 frames per second at 4K bitrate, it looks really good. I would say it looks really good. Obviously, it's not going to look as good as 1080p, but it's a small step above 720p. And if you push it at 3500 or 4000 kilobits per second, you could run it at 60 frames per second, but you're going to notice a little more pixelation, a little more artifacting. So I'd stick with 30 frames per second if you're at about 3500 frame rate, 3500 bit rate. All right, let's move into the sweet spot, the 1080p. This is what everybody wants to stream at. So what can you get with 3000 bit rate at 1080p? Well, 30 frames per second, you can see it doesn't look that bad. But the higher upload you've got, the better your results are going to be. That is obvious, but just taking a look at these images, you can see that there's a incremental increase in the quality of the picture as we move up into 4000, 4500, and I believe we're going to go all the way up into 6000 kilobits per second here as an example. And 6000 30 frames per second, you don't really need to do that. You can move on into 60 frames per second at that high of a bit rate. Now obviously, the goal of a streamer is to stream at the highest quality possible. 1080p, 60 frames per second. That's what people want to stream at. Now, I wouldn't really recommend anybody stream at 1080p, 60 frames per second for World of Warcraft at lower than maybe 5000 bitrate. As you can see in the examples here, in some motion, which obviously World of Warcraft is an MMO, so you're going to be moving yourself around, you're going to be interacting with the world around you. There's going to be motion, and then especially if you're going to be doing raiding or dungeons. 3000, 3500, 4K is just not going to cut it at 60 frames per second. If you've got 4K or 4500 bitrate, try looking at that 810p that I was talking about earlier, or drop it to 30 frames per second. It's not going to kill you. I know a lot of people really want to hit that 60 frames per second, and I don't blame you. That's what I want to hit too, but sometimes you can't make it happen. Sometimes your PC hardware just can't push that resolution out. So here's that sweet spot, 1080p, 60 frames per second. So in conclusion, 1080p, obviously 1080p, 60 frames per second at 6K bitrate. That's what you want to hit. 1080p 30 frames per second though, you could really be rocking it at about 4500 bit rate. It's gonna be a little pixelated, but when you've got 4500 bit rate and you really want to hit that 1080p, it's not gonna be the end of the world. Just stick with 30 frames per second. But my real recommendation, if you have only 3500 or 4K bit rate to mess around with, 1080p 30 frames per second, or again, like I was saying earlier, you could drop it to 810 and you might even be able to get a good 60 FPS on that. Streaming is one of the most fun things that you can do, but obviously it can be very overwhelming to get started. One of the things that I really want to make sure that people understand is you can make mistakes and you can go back and look at your stream and say, you know what, I should have been streaming at 720p 60 frames per second with that bit rate. I should have been doing that. And you're going to need to monitor your stream a lot in the early days because everybody's hardware is a little bit different. Obviously, if you buy the best of the best, if you're buying a top end i7 processor and you've got a 1080 Ti, you're cranking those settings all the way up on your games and you're cranking those settings up on your stream. But you're gonna run into bottlenecks. It's just gonna happen unless you have two computers like a lot of the top end streamers do. Unless you have two computers, one for gaming and one for streaming, you're probably gonna have to make some compromises. And one of those compromises might be 60 frames per second. Because even if your internet is fantastic, your computer might not be able to handle streaming at 1080p 60 frames per second at 6K. So mess around with it, see how your computer does, but I hope that these examples help you decide what options are acceptable to you in your streaming. So now for your viewing pleasure, this is only at 30 frames per second because there's not a lot of motion going on, so there's not really a benefit in doing 60 frames per second, but I wanted to compare a lot of different resolutions and bit rates, just showing my Death Knight sitting on their hippogriff right in front of the world tree burning behind it, just so you can get a really good idea of the difference between the resolutions and bit rates. And I'm just going to kind of rapidly go through that. So there you have it. I'm going to show you the very top end of each of those resolutions. The bitrate that I captured for them, 480p, 30 frames per second, 3K bitrate. Looks fine actually, just sitting there, but when you bump it up to 720p, noticeable difference. Moving it to 810, minor difference. And then finally, when you move on into 1080p at 5K bitrate is what I chose for this. You can see it looks crispy and clean. But once again, I know shooting for 1080p 60 frames per second is what everybody wants to do, but if you can't do it, don't let that fact beat you up. Make sure that you're just streaming. Just have fun. People are going to show up for you. They're not going to show up because your stream is 1080p 60 frames per second. If you can pump out a 720p 30 frames per second stream, then you know what? People will show up for that. And even if you have to go a little bit lower, I've seen a lot of streams with a 564 I think it's 564. I'm gonna have to check now, but I've seen people use all different kinds of resolution. Now personally, I wouldn't stream at anything lower than 720p 30 frames per second, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't stream at something lower than 720p. I hope I helped you out. If I did, let me know in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next video. Until next time, everybody, Tonka out.